Big news coming out of the league over the last week or so, obviously, is the implementation of the new rules surrounding the draft combine and the eligibility of players or high school players who sign professional contracts with teams such as G League Ignite, Overtime Elite, or overseas. So basically, beginning in 2024, I've just highlighted a few key points here. It's a 91-page jointly written memo set out by both the NBA and the Players Association, and it covers the fact that all invited players to the combine will be required to participate and attend or be ineligible to be drafted until the first subsequent draft for which the player fully attends and participates. So the participation will include league medical examinations, sharing of medical history and biomechanical and functional movement testing, as well as strength and agility testing, shooting drills, performance, the whole lot that they normally do. Players will also be required to conduct team interviews, media circuits, player development sessions, and other assessments as determined by the NBA in consultation with the Players Associations. Players will not be compelled to compete in 5-on-5 scrimmaging, which typically only a handful of the first round prospects elect to participate in. So I think that the big advantage of this, and I'll let you have your take first, but I'm going to say this is very much, I guess, something that they're trying to prevent the whole load management thing starting from too young in their career, because if they're, I guess, withdrawing from these kind of events or these kind of situations, like for example, the combine, then if they're getting exemptions from this and they're allowed to not have to participate in this, then it sort of just sets a precedence for their career. It's like, well, if I don't have to participate in the combine, then, it's all right if I miss a game or two here and there. So that's at least the start on what the take that I'll have going forward. But I'll let you give your take on this first change, which is obviously regarding the combine. What do you think of this rule?
So in terms of the NBA draft combine, I love how they're making it so you have to participate, because so many of these players keep their medicals away from certain franchises that are less attractive to them, that they don't really want to be a part of, in hopes of almost steering their way to become NBA player for a franchise that they want to play for. And usually that's the bigger cities like LA, New York, Chicago, Miami, all those types of cities, the preferred destinations. But I don't think that's how it should be. I think a lot of these guys are actually kind of hurting their stock because they do want to play for these huge market teams. But I think it's pretty important to have all these guys go to the combine and complete proper, fully well done medicals, because look, NBA teams want to know what they're getting themselves into when drafting these guys of such high profiles. And yeah, it would be a shame if you drafted someone, for example, say Lonzo Ball of right now entered the draft and he was this deteriorated and banged up and injured, and that was your guy you wanted at number 2. It would be a shame if you drafted him at number 2. So I do like these new changes.
Yeah, I think it's a good decision. Like I said, the precedence that it sets is that, look, if you're wanting to be a part of this league and if you're wanting to become a professional basketball player as part of the NBA, you're required to show up, turn up, and do what's expected of you. You know what I mean? Same as when you're signing that professional contract. Teams are investing millions of dollars in you. Your life is about to change. The least you could do is obviously do what you need to do and tick off the boxes that are required from you. And, I think it's a massive investment these teams are making. It's a business at the end of the day. I know we talk about, obviously, that, there's a human element to this, but ultimately it is a business. There is billions of dollars on the line, not just obviously in the entire league, but on a team scale. These teams are now worth upwards of $2 billion in the one example, obviously, being the Dallas Mavericks. And, there's richer franchises than that. But what I'm saying is, when there's that much money involved, you have to make sure that the investment you're making is the right decision. You know what I mean? So I'm all for this. So there's a couple other points here regarding this. So the only time they're able to, or if they're unable to participate because of playing with a FIBA club team in season, family tragedy, the birth of a child, or an injury as determined by the medical director of the combine, They won't have to participate at the combine, but will require to complete components at a later date. So failure to do so will result in being ineligible to be selected on draft night. So there'll be limits on sharing medical information amongst teams based on the projected draft range of top players. So what they'll do is they'll actually assess the top 10 prospects according to like a unanimous sort of decision. And then, for example, the projected number 1 pick will have his medical information shared only with teams picking in the top 10. Players ranked 2 to 6 will be shared in the teams in the top 15, and players 7 to 10 with teams in the top 25, with the exception of potentially life-threatening injury or medical conditions that render a player unfit to perform his duties as a professional basketball player in accordance with the fitness to play panel process. So there are certain exemptions that can be made there, but obviously for the most part, it's pretty much a duty of care from both parties to make sure that obviously all the information is disclosed. They know what they're getting themselves into. The last thing they want is to have a player that has some degenerative condition that they weren't aware of, and obviously in the case of Lonzo Ball, something as severe as that. It's now set these franchises back. Obviously the Lakers picked him. That wasn't really where the initial injuries happened, but it did set the precedence for that to sort of play out the way it did. And again, I just think it's the best way of going forward with this sort of stuff, because yes, you've got your in-season play, the way they've performed on tape, etc. Teams view that. They go out to these games overseas or to college or whatever. They look at these players in person. They know what they kind of expect to see from them on an NBA court or how they'll project. But it's like an examination. You go to college, you go to high school to get your certificate. This is kind of like your last exam. You need to pass all the tests, the examinations to be able to officially be qualified or get your certificate. So I don't disagree at all with this change from the NBA, and I think, like I said, it might start to really change the shift in where the NBA is going with hopefully the load management side of things as well. But the second change is, or the big change that obviously involves with this new CBA is there will be no more automatic eligibility for high school or collegiate players who sign professional contracts with entities such as G League Ignite, Overtime Elite, or for example, the Australian NBL, which we've seen LaMelo Ball, Usman Dieng, a couple other guys, RJ Hampton, obviously go down that path. So basically, the way it worked in the past was if you go down those routes straight out of high school, there was no option for you to stay there an extra year. You would have to leave and go to the draft, regardless of the season you had, the production you had straight out of that draft. But with this new rule change, it's forcing these guys to now spend at least 2 years in the system to be able to obviously develop to a higher level. So the disadvantage to that is obviously some guys might have a really elite season their first year that they turn pro or that they spend in this particular environment, and then their second year they might struggle massively, and then that impacts their draft stock. Again, they could then stay an extra year, but this can hurt certain guys. For example, it worked in the favor of guys like LaMelo Ball. They obviously improved their draft stock by doing or performing to that certain level when they played for Illawarra in his case. But obviously it impacted guys like, who could I say? Jaden Hardy, for example. He was a highly touted high school recruit, came out to the G League Ignite, didn't shoot the ball well, sort of his deficiencies showed, but because of that rule forcing him to have to come out of that G League Ignite straight out of his first year into the NBA draft without any option to extend, that then significantly dropped his draft stock and sort of changed the perspective that teams had on him before he obviously joined G League Ignite. So there are some pros and cons there, and I think I like both sides of it. I think there's pros and cons to take from it, but all in all, it's a little bit confusing as well when you look at it. It's like, yeah, they have to be this many years, but then college players can still go one and done. So it just doesn't really makes sense to me, because it should come down ultimately to the NBA teams and the executives and the scouts working in their front office to make the judgment calls. If a guy wants to leave after his first year and he wants to take the plunge into the NBA draft, that's on the NBA team and the executives that are working there to make that decision to say, look, we don't think he's ready. We don't think this guy projects well right now as an NBA prospect. He might have a bit of potential, but he sees himself as like a first round pick. We don't see him in that aspect. So we'll steer clear of him until that stage, or we won't draft him at all. Whereas some teams just take the chance and they think, oh, we haven't seen enough of him. Oh, I don't know how to evaluate him. Let's just pick him in the lottery. And then that's when these teams then might make the wrong call in that particular instance. So I can see why these changes have been put into place. But again, it's an interesting one. I don't know. It's going to be one we'll have to really look over the next few years and gauge properly to be able to see how it really impacts these prospects going forward.
Yeah. No, I feel like this rule, it can go two ways. When I think of players who've played overseas and it's kind of negatively impacted them and they probably should have stayed another year, I think of guys like, I don't know if you remember the name, but Brian Bowen he played for the Pacers.
I remember him. He had the Odell Beckham cut.
Yeah. Yeah. He was like a McDonald's All-American, and at the time, coming out of high school, people were thinking this guy's a lottery pick. He came to our league, the NBL, played for the Sydney Kings, didn't really play all too well, stunk it up. I don't even think he got drafted, but he definitely could have used another year playing in the NBL, and I don't think it would have hurt his draft stock necessarily. I think teams would have actually looked at him as a former McDonald's All-American and thought, hey, let's take a chance of him. I genuinely think he would have been a high pick if he had stayed another year playing overseas. But then there's also guys that come out, I'll use NBL because it's the league I probably watch the most, like LaMelo and Giddey. Well, Giddey's not an American prospect, but LaMelo, RJ, and, Usman Dieng, and even this year Ryan Rupert, they've benefited playing overseas for the 1 year, and not all of them have really succeeded. I wouldn't say Usman Dieng was very good, or Rupert, or even RJ to an extent. He was okay, but it's so hard to tell because teams draft on upside, but sometimes drafting off upside isn't necessarily the right thing to do because you're taking a chance on like an 18-year-old kid, soon to be 19, who's not really doing all too much overseas, probably putting up around 7 points per game off 38% shooting splits. Like, it's too little of a sample size to kind of draft him off. Whereas making him stay 2 years, you really get a gauge of how good they actually are because you see their progression from year 1 to year 2.
Yeah, it's a really tough one because you look at it, the same situation in college happened as well. Like certain guys, you look at Kyrie Irving, I think he played like maybe 10 or 11 games his freshman year and ended up being the number 1 pick. And obviously we've seen how that's turned out. Guys like Darius Garland, I think played 6 or 7 games for Vanderbilt in his freshman year, but he obviously in those games he really showed what he could do. And I think, again, that one obviously has worked out as well. So sometimes the lack of a sample size or the lack of production in a certain year due to various factors, obviously both of those were results of injuries that kept them out for their freshman year. But I think they always had the intention of being one and done players, which is why it doesn't really make sense to me, because if you're going to make that rule implemented to guys from high school going into a professional contract such as G League Ignite or the NBL or overseas, wherever they decide to play, then it should the same rule then be implemented in college, preventing guys from being one and dones? Because it's like, hang on, you're going to penalize guys who go into the professional pathway to then have to say you have to spend 2 years there when they're actually, it's probably more of a challenge for them to go there, and there's more of an exposure to a higher level of basketball. So it's like, hang on, if they've exposed themselves to this level and, they can you can sort of see how they go against men and, bigger bodies, etc., then shouldn't that be a better judge than playing against college players who, some of them aren't even close to being projected to even go play professional ball at some instances, you know what I mean? So, I don't know, it's hit and miss. I think that they might be trying to really save college basketball. Obviously, they did that.
I think they are.
Yeah, I think so too, because I think even bringing in the NIL, had they not done that, I think college basketball would have died off a long, long time ago. You know what I mean? I think, it wouldn't have been sustainable. These guys, it's like, hang on, why the hell can't we go straight out of high school? But you're forcing us to go to college for a year, but we're not getting anything out of making millions and billions of dollars for your institutions. We should get a slice of the pie. So I think that, at least, I'm glad they brought that in, because it's sort of solved a bit of the issue, a bit of the problem. But at the same time, now you're confusing the scenario a little bit again by forcing these guys to spend 2 years when college is still one and done, which to me just doesn't make sense. So I think they just need a bit more clarity regarding this, and I think as long as we just see the progression once it does start and how it has either made the league better or worse in terms of these prospects, then we'll get a better gauge of that. But again, I did say this in one of the other episodes. I mentioned that it does impact the talent pool, and it does dilute it when a lot of these guys who aren't ready to come into the league automatically do. And I think that's when then the standard of the league drops a little bit, because you got guys who aren't NBA ready, aren't even ready to play minutes, coming in and declaring for the draft, and then the rosters are full of these guys. You know what I mean? Whether they end up being two-way players or just strictly in the G League, it's a different story. But I just think it's the same as the NFL. Like, you spend 2 or 3 years in college and you're ready to go. You're ready to jump straight into the NFL and ready to contribute from day one. Whereas had they come out straight out of as a freshman or only spent 1 year in college, they'd be monstered by these guys in the NFL. So I kind of think there's a positive element and aspect to it by doing so, because again, you only get the best of the best prospects, and both of these rules intertwined just make it for better viewing going forward. Because one, if you have the best players participating at the combine and you know every little detail about them, it makes the decisions that these NBA teams have to make in picking these guys a lot more clearer. And then even with this one, when they're not ready to jump into the league, they spend an extra year there, they develop their body, they develop parts of their game that, are profound weaknesses or areas to improve, and then you got better players coming into the league and are ready to go the moment they step foot in the NBA.
Yeah, I really like that aspect of staying in college and developing your game, and once you're ready, you declare. And if that's, you stay 2 to 3 years, you stay 2 to 3 years, or even the 4 years. And we've seen that's worked in the past. Players have done that. I'll use an example. I think Dylan Brooks, 2 to 3 years, stayed there, developed, still was a 20 to 30 pick, and he's had a very solid career. I really like that aspect of college basketball. But then I think of, for example, I remember being in primary school here, that's what they call it. Emmanuel Mudiay, he went to China, and this guy was still a top 10 pick, I think 6 or 7 for the Denver Nuggets.
Yeah. Played
in China. I don't necessarily think he played bad, but that level of competition in China, obviously it's not really the greatest, and he didn't play super amazing, but it was still enough to where he got picked. So I do kind of like the NBA adding this rule on that aspect, because look, you got to be wise with your decision. If you're Emmanuel Mudiay and you go to China and you don't really develop your game all too well, and you come into the league, you're still a solid player, but look, your shot's not developed fully, and you haven't really got all too much better since high school. Like, he probably was the exact same player he was in high school, and to me, I think that stunted his NBA career. So look, I like this rule on that aspect, but I also think, look, if you're ready after that first year, playing in the pros, and you're ready to declare, I think you should be able to declare. But yeah, I do understand where the NBA and Adam Silver are coming from.
Just one last point before we wrap this topic up. I just wanted to add, obviously, another guy that spent 4 years in college, Damian Lillard. You see how ready-made he was the moment he's come into the league, played for all 4 years at Weber State. And obviously we've seen what he's able to do year in, year out. He didn't have a season pretty much below, I think his rookie year, he averaged about just over 19 points per game. Whereas every other year he's averaged in the 20s, and he's just been ready-made to play at that high level the moment he came out of college. And I think it's sort of maybe it makes these guys appreciate the grind a bit more. So when they do get there, they're like, well, you know what? I've spent my 4 years working my ass off to get to this point and improve. You know, it's beneficial for me. It obviously doesn't work for every guy, like we've spoken about already, but I think it's super beneficial. And back to the Moutier one that you mentioned, had the NIL existed when Emmanuel Moutier,
He probably would have, yeah.
he would have probably just gone to college, because he probably could have got a lot of brand recognition from certain sponsors depending on where he decided to go to college. You know what I mean? So I think that in itself might have stunted his growth, the fact that they didn't bring the NIL in earlier, and that impacted college basketball. College basketball complains like, oh, you know, Emmanuel Moutier and all these guys are going overseas. It's, well, you know, well, bring the NIL in earlier. Let these guys make bank off their own name, and then you wouldn't have had this issue in the first place, and you won't have underdone players coming into the league because they're playing against weak competition overseas, especially in China. So, you know, there's a lot of issues that could have been resolved way earlier had they just done this from the get-go. But, you know, at least we're learning, we're making steps to progress this, and fingers crossed this is the right decision and the right direction the NBA has made to make basketball better in the league in the long run.